Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. We are in another Torah portion. This is our second one in Exodus, Vayera, and this is Exodus 6:2 through 9:35. And this is where we see Moshe and Aaron begin executing the plagues or the judgments or the signs of Yahweh against Pharaoh and against the land of Egypt. And now this portion starts out really interesting because right away, chapter 6, verse 2, which is the first verse of the portion, it says that Elohim is speaking to Moshe, and he says to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. Now, if you remember, when he first met Moses and told Moses that he's going to be the one to help let his people go execute this exodus from Egypt, he introduces himself as Aa, Asher, Aa. But here he's saying, I am Yahweh. And what I find so interesting about this is that the great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, didn't even know him by his name. They just knew him as El Shaddai. But if you remember back to our discussion before, last week, about names and what names mean, it's not just the name, it's not just Yahweh, but it's the, what's the word I'm looking for? The reputation, the sign, the meaning, the character. And I think this goes back to exactly what we were talking about last week, where it's not just that he's known by the name Yahweh, but what he's going to do is be known as the God, the one God. He's going to be over the Egyptian gods. They're going to have no choice, the Egyptians, but to see him as the God of the universe. And skipping ahead, you kind of see this starting to come to play. So in chapter 7, well, let's go to chapter 6 first, because it happens first. Chronologically, it says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. You shall know that I, Yahweh, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. So right now he's saying that you're going to know, you, the Israelites, my people, will know that I'm Yahweh. And then in chapter 7, verse 5, he's now speaking about the Egyptians. He says, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. How? When? When I stretch out my hand over Egypt and bring out the Israelites from their midst. And so this just further supports this idea of him showing himself to be above the gods of Egypt, executing judgments on the gods of Egypt and on Pharaoh and on the land, and prevailing, and through that his people prevailing. Now the other thing that's interesting, in verse 5, chapter 6, Yahweh speaking, he says, I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. And this is the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you might think, well, did he forget the covenant? That seems a little weird. He's God. First of all, God doesn't really forget things. Otherwise, if he did, he'd be no better than humans. But also, why would, if the covenant was that important between him and his people, why would he forget it? Oh, there's a little bit more there. And I looked up the Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word there for what has been translated as remembered is zakar. And it does mean to remember or to recall. But another meaning, which I found fascinating, is to mark as to be recognized. And this made me think of us being sealed. You know, we have the mark on our foreheads, and we will be sealed at the end of days for what you could call the greater Exodus. We are sealed at the end of days, and that's how we are distinct and separated from those who don't belong to Yahweh. And this whole theme we're going to see multiple times throughout this portion, as you'll see, and it's really exciting how it connects and how it is the same all throughout, and we see it in different areas. Now at this point, there's kind of like an interesting breakout, and you start getting the genealogy of the sons of Israel. And in chapter 6, verse 14, it says the following are the heads of their respective clans, and it goes through Reuben and Simeon, the first and second born, and then it comes to Levi, And now you get a lot of detail. You have not just the names of the sons of Levi, but the names of the sons of Levi. You have how long they've lived. You have the story of Moshe and Aaron's mother and father. And then it stops. It doesn't go beyond Levi. And so I found that weird, but maybe it's just significant in the sense that Moshe and Aaron came from the tribe of Levi. I'm not sure why the genealogy is stopped there, why it includes Reuben and Simeon, but none of the other sons of Israel after that. Now, in chapter 7, verse 1, I've seen this before, and I'm sure a lot of you have also noticed it. But it says, Yahweh replied to Moses, "See, I place you in the role of God to Pharaoh with your brother Aaron as your prophet." So I just looked up the Hebrew. The Hebrew word here is Elohim, the plural version, which I found interesting. Normally when we see the plural version of Elohim in scripture, we interpret it to mean Yeshua is there present with the Father, and it's just more proof in the Hebrew text of Yeshua being God, essentially. Why it would be plural here referring to Moses, I'm unsure. But the basic meaning of the word means ruler or judge, and we definitely see this. He kind of rules over Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh thinks he has the upper hand. He really doesn't. We see this a little later with some of the plagues where at one point Moshe actually says, "Okay, show yourself as higher above me, and you tell me when to intercede for you. You give me the time, and I'll do it when you say." But really, in the end, we see that he actually rules over Pharaoh and judges him by executing these judgments of Yahweh. And then prophet simply means spokesman or speaker, which we see that. I mean, that's exactly why Aaron was chosen, because Moshe was afraid of speaking. Now, the other interesting thing that comes out multiple times in this portion is the phrase, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or he hardened his heart, or Yahweh hardened his heart. Those are all different ways that we can see it. Or stiffens, which is what's used in the King James Version. And usually when we read this, we think, oh, his heart is hard against the Egyptians. He's emotionless. He doesn't have any empathy for them. He's just hard against them. But when you look at the Hebrew, there's actually two Hebrew words used here. And it just depends on where you're at in the scripture. So the first one is chazak, which means to strengthen, to firm up, to be resolute. And so it's not so much that he is not empathetic against the Israelites or just cold-hearted. It's that he's resolute in his decision. He's even more committed to it. And that decision is he's not going to let them go. Why? Because if he lets them go, that's like saying they're not his people. He doesn't have control over them. And he's going to allow them to go serve another god, whereas he should be the God that they're serving. Now, the other word that's used here is in the Hebrew kabed, so very similar, kazak, kabed, and this means heavy, difficult, or oppressive. And so this is almost, when I was reading it, I didn't just find it interesting that it's oppressive, because yes, it's oppressive against the Israelites, but this struck me as something more deeply emotional that Pharaoh feels. You know, when your heart's heavy, you're sad, you're burdened, you're just depressed, you don't know what to do. And this is the feeling that I had with this. And now it switches back and forth, and I think there's some greater significance there, but until I have further understanding, I don't know the significance of the switching back and forth, and I'll point out a couple of these later. Now, in chapter 8, verse 4, we've just had the plague or the sign of the frogs that come out of the Nile, and they cover the land. And this is the first time that Pharaoh asks Moses to remove the plague. And he says that he'll let the Egyptians go and sacrifice. So the verse actually says, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron. And it says, plead with Yahweh to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to Yahweh. And so what's interesting here is he's actually saying the name Yahweh. He's not using Elohim. So if you look at the Hebrew, it's Yahweh that's used here. So finally, Pharaoh is starting to get it and give Yahweh the glory. But the other thing is interesting is he says, entreat Yahweh, or plead with Yahweh for him. And the Hebrew word here is athar, which means intercede. So it's interesting, Pharaoh, if you don't believe in this God, why are you asking Moshe to intercede for him? And so something is happening here, and we start to see this change in Pharaoh. Now in 8 verse 11, I'm just going to read it. It says, so this is when the frogs go away. So Moshe does as Pharaoh asks, the frogs are gone. They're gone at, Moses asks at the time that Pharaoh tells him to. So this is what I was mentioning earlier, where Moshe said, here you go, tell me when to ask to remove him and I will. And then they're gone and Pharaoh sees it. And he's like, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them as Yahweh had spoken. And so in this instance, the word that's used here is kabed, which is heavy. His heart is heavy, oppressive, difficult, not resolute. That's not the word that's used here. And when it says would not heed, the Hebrew word here for heed is listen intelligently or with attention. So he's not listening to what Moshe and Aaron are asking for. Now, this is the 4th sign, but the 3rd plague. Now, the reason why I'm calling it the 4th sign is because the first sign that was actually done with Moses and Aaron was turning the staff into a snake. So this isn't usually counted as number 1 because it's not a plague over the land of Egypt. It's just the first thing that Moses and Aaron do to show that Yahweh is Yahweh. And it's actually one of the first signs. I don't remember if it's the first, but remember when Moshe was asking, how are the people going to know that I am telling the truth and that you sent me? And he gives him these signs, and one of them is the rod buds. And so in this case, it's turning into a snake, but it's something with the rod that we see transforming. And so being the 4th sign, the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Dalet, which means door, and is often interpreted as the Messiah, because Messiah Yeshua is the door to everything. I mean, he even says, I'm the door, knock, and it shall be opened. What's interesting about this sign is that the magicians could not replicate this one. So they replicated the staff turning into the snake. They were able to make the Nile turn into blood. They were even able to bring the frogs out. But this one, they couldn't replicate. So this is like, and in fact, they actually say this is the finger of God. So let's read it. This is the lice. Sorry, I kind of skipped that context for you. So the frogs are removed and the next plague comes. This is the lice. And in verse 15 of chapter 8, the magicians say to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, because they haven't been able to replicate it. And so all this connection with it being the 4th sign, significant of Messiah, they can't replicate it. Now we're beginning to see the sovereignty of Yahweh and the separation between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. And so this is all happening stepwise. This is happening exactly as he said it would. And step by step, he's beginning to show himself as Yahweh, the one true God, over all of the other gods of the earth who indeed aren't actually true. Now the 5th sign, or the 4th plague, and I want to explain it both ways because it can be significant either way. This is where now we see a separation between the Israelites and the Egyptians. So this is the plague that doesn't happen in Goshen. Yahweh specifies that it's only going to happen in the land of Egypt, not Goshen where the Israelites are residing. And the actual phraseology, let's read it. It's verse 18, chapter 8. On that day I will set apart the region of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there, that you may know that I, Yahweh, am in the midst of the land. Verse 19, and I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall come to pass. So already, just reading it that way, it's so significant and pregnant with meaning, because we know that he separates us out. Kadosh, holy, be you holy because I am holy. It means separate. We're supposed to be separated unto him. And that's why it's so important that they leave the land of Egypt, where all the false gods are, where all of the false ways of worshiping gods are, and they go into the wilderness to be fully separated unto their God and worship him the way he wants to be worshipped. But it gets even more exciting when you look deeper. So if you look at the Hebrew words, I will make a distinction between my people and yours. The Hebrew word there is paduth, and that means ransom. And so here he's saying, I'm going to ransom them. I'm going to redeem them. And so if you look at this as the fifth sign, the fifth letter in the Hebrew is He, which means revelation. So he's revealing here his ultimate plan for humanity, which is redemption through escape from Egypt, but ultimately through the Messiah. Now, if you see this as the fourth plague, removing that first sign of the staff, then and connect that to Dalet and Messiah. Messiah is the one who redeems us and who ransoms us with his blood, and so is really, really deep with meaning, regardless of which way you look at it. Now, the other thing that is really just interesting and impactful is when he's talking about the distinction, he says, tomorrow this sign shall be known. And the Hebrew word for sign there is oath, which can mean sign, but the meaning is a distinguishing mark. And so he's marking his people for separation and for the ultimate redemption. And this connects back to what we were talking about earlier, where when he says, I remember in my covenant, and we said the word remember there was recall or to mark. And so here it is, that theme of marking, of sealing, of setting apart his people is showing up again in the way that he's describing these plagues and how they're executed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that if he's specifying that this plague is not to happen in Goshen, it indicates that the other plagues did. And this is exactly what we see, excuse me, in the prophecies about the end of days. You know, a lot of people understand or interpret the scripture to mean that we're actually going to escape the Great Tribulation because we're believers and we don't get to go through all that. That's not true. We're going to experience it just like everyone else. It's testing our faith. It's hardening. I don't think I'm going to use the word harden there, but it's making us resolute and stronger in our faith. Is making it solid. That's kind of what I mean by the word hard. And so you see it here too. Right before the Exodus, the Israelites experienced the first few plagues with the Egyptians equally. It's only after this point where you start seeing the distinctions. Now, the translation here is insects, a swarm of insects, but of insects, if you look at it in the King James Version, it's italicized, meaning that the translators put it there because that's what they think it means, or that's how they interpret it to bring full meaning to the scripture. And when you see the insects going into the houses or into the word into there is italicized as well. So there's some extrapolation that's happening here. And now it could be physical insects, which would be bad. But if you look up the Hebrew word for swarm, which is the actual word, so swarm of insects, the insects is added, you get the Hebrew word aro, which does mean swarm. But the interesting thing here is that Strong says the probable meaning is from mixture. And it says incessant or involved motion. But the root word is mixture and intermingle. And I find that really interesting because we know from scripture that mixing and intermingling is not what Yahweh wants. And so you have this juxtaposed against his people being set apart, but you have this mixing and intermingling, incessant, it's like chaos, motion in the land of Egypt. And the ultimate consequence of this, scripture says, is that the land was corrupted. And the Hebrew word there is shakath, and that means destroy, corrupt, and decay. And that is exactly what we see throughout scripture everywhere. When there's intermingling, there's corruption, there's decay. Every time the Israelites intermingled and intermarried with other nations, what happened? They became corrupt because they were no longer separated fully out to Yahweh. They now had other ways of worshiping other gods coming in, and it messed it up. And so we see this right here with this plague. And so I propose that perhaps the plague was more than just insects. It was this concept and this chaos and this intermingling, this mixing that Yahweh put upon the land, but that didn't touch Goshen. And so it just emphasizes the fact that Yahweh's people are separate. They're not intermingling. They're becoming separate from Egypt now, and they're beginning already their process of becoming holy unto Yahweh so that he can once again dwell in their midst. Now in chapter 8, verse 21, we see another thing that's new, and Pharaoh is summoning Moses and Aaron, and he actually says, okay, go sacrifice to your God, but he's saying within the land. And so Moses is like, no, we've got to go to the wilderness. We can't sacrifice in the land. What we sacrifice is abominable to the Egyptians. They're going to stone us. And so Pharaoh says, fine, go into the wilderness, but don't go too far away, and intercede for me. So you see him asking for intercession again. So he does. He intercedes, which he asks for the swarms to go away. And what happens is Pharaoh becomes stubborn again, big surprise. So now Moshe has to go and tell him about the next plague. And so this now is the livestock having a pestilence, they die. Pharaoh's asking, he finds that not one of the livestock of the Egyptians have lived. All the ones of the Israelites are okay. And then you get the seventh sign. And this time is different because they're not going to Pharaoh and saying, here's what's going to happen. They go to him and they're saying, here's what happens. They lift their hands to the sky with the soot. They throw it in the air, and now you get the seventh plague. Also interesting and new about this one, in verse 12 of chapter 9, it says, so once again, the magicians can't do it. Not only that, they can't even come out of their houses because they're so severely inflamed because of this dust. And it says now that Yahweh has stiffened Pharaoh's heart. And in this case, it's the Hebrew word chazak, which does mean strengthened and resolute. So up until this point, it's Pharaoh who's hardening his heart, or it just says his heart was hardened. But here, it specifies that Yahweh's doing it. And we kind of begin to see later why this might be, because eventually Yahweh does tell Pharaoh, look, I'm allowing this to happen because I'm going to be glorified through you. So through your repeat stubbornness, allowing me to continue showing my signs and wonders, I'm just emphasizing and solidifying myself and showing that I am the king. And so the other thing that's super interesting is you begin to see a change in the Egyptians as well. So maybe Pharaoh is continuing to be strong and resolute, but his people are not. And I'm saying his people for a reason. So in in verse 20, it says, those among Pharaoh's courtiers who feared Yahweh's word brought their slaves and livestock indoors to safety. And so here has been the prophecy of the hail coming. But those who paid no regard to the word of Yahweh left their slaves and livestock in the open. And so feared Yahweh's word. And the fear here, the Hebrew word does mean reverent and afraid, and their speech and utterance. But what's interesting is when you look at he who did not fear. So those who didn't, or who paid no regard, as it's translated here, to the word of Yahweh, they're leaving their slaves in the open. And the Hebrew word that's used there means, it's actually two in succession in the Strongs, and together they mean put in the inner man, or in the mind. And this is exactly how it's described when it talks about Yahweh's Torah. We're supposed to have it in the inner man, in the mind, in the heart. He's going to write it on our hearts and on our minds. I mean, that's the whole Shema, write it upon our hearts and our minds. And essentially what this means is that it permeates who we are. And I find it interesting that that's what's happening here. They're not putting it into their inner mind. And so it's just another prophecy of what happens if you don't do that. And we see it again later, of course, at Sinai, where he's talking about the blessings and the curses. And this is what happens if you follow it and if you don't. But I just found that so interesting and so beautiful that there's that prophecy there. Now, verse 27, something really interesting. Pharaoh sends for Moses and Aaron again, but he says something interesting. So he says, I stand guilty this time. Yahweh is in the right, I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with Yahweh that there may be an end to his thunder and hail. It doesn't, what he's not saying isn't actually Yahweh's right and I'm wrong. That's kind of like a duh. To get that long to figure it out. What he's actually saying is Yahweh is righteous and I have sinned. And so this is the first time that he is describing his own behavior as sinning or missing the mark. And he's now admitting that Yahweh is righteous, the righteous one, and he and his people are unrighteous. So very interesting, and we see this again happening a little later. And so step by step, these things are happening. The Israelites are beginning to be set apart. And we see that another transformation, which is interesting because in chapter 9, verse 1, I'm going to back up a little bit. But speaking about this set apart, this is when Moses is again going to Pharaoh, and he says, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Yahweh, the Elohim of the Hebrews, let my people go and worship me. This is the first time that he's referred to as the God of the Hebrews. Usually it's just Yahweh says this, let my people go. And so this is just further solidifying that distinction of his people. Hebrew means crossed over. They're going to cross over. So here's a prophecy here. They're crossing over through the dry land on the sea. But it's just further message from Yahweh to Pharaoh that, look, these are my people, not yours. I am God, not you. And we see this happening in steps throughout this process of these signs and wonders. And you also see Pharaoh kind of slowly going through this transformation too. And his courtiers as well. It happens even quicker with them. They're like, look, dude, this is the finger of God. Stop ignoring it. He continues to be stubborn, but eventually he has to cede certain things. And in this case, he's ceding, okay, I have missed the mark. I have sinned. Yahweh is righteous. I can only imagine how much this irked him and bothered him. And it's a big deal for Pharaoh to say something like that, because Pharaoh was seen as a god in the land of Egypt. And I think that's why it's so significant in the beginning that Yahweh is saying that Moses is going to be like a god to Pharaoh, a ruler, a judge, because this puts him down. This puts him in his place. So not only does he have to be below Yahweh, but he's below this Hebrew man, or these two Hebrew men who are essentially just kind of making him look stupid, because they keep hitting him over and over and over again with these signs and wonders. And that's probably a little bit why he keeps hardening his heart. There's some personal pride there as well. He can't just give up that easy. And so that was the end of this portion. Next week's portion is going to be really special, because this is when the last couple of plagues are inflicted, the darkness and then the death of the firstborn. It's also a really special portion for me, because it was the Torah portion that was read the week that I was born. And this year it happens to also be my Torah portion. It's the portion that starts Friday night, and my birthday will be Sunday. And so it comes around again as being my portion. I don't think that's insignificant, so I'm excited to see what revelation Yahweh brings to me this year. But it's always a special portion for me, because it's my birth Torah portion. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. As always, make comments. I love the comments I've been getting. Such wonderful discussion, thought-provoking, and revelation revealing. So keep it coming. Shabbat Shalom.